$1 for your first roll, $10 for your second roll, $100 for your third roll. Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
But seriously though, when you eat asparagus and you go to you take a piss later, can you smell it?
No. Well, I don't actually eat asparagus, so that's probably the reason why.
Yeah, that would have to be a prerequisite, unfortunately. I actually have memories of tinned asparagus growing up, and it was really sloppy and disgusting. And I think I hated asparagus for a long time. Anyway, let's put a pin in the asparagus talk.
So last week we talked about climate change, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were after last week's episode.
Well, I'm still waiting to be randomly fired from my job after that episode. It'll be interesting to see how people respond to it, because I think actually maybe we are being a bit too sensitive with support for climate change. It could be one of those topics too that because it's so complex, people just don't really take the time to read up on it. And as a result, in private, their feelings of support or opposition aren't very strong at all. I have a feeling it veers into that apathetic territory. It's something you should care about, but you don't really.
Do you think that we are the kind of people that those who yell about climate emergency are trying to target? Like, I don't think we're apathetic in the sense that we think, oh, there's nothing here to be done, but somewhat apathetic in the sense that we were probably suggesting that
it's overblown.
The climate emergency folk are overdoing it. And so do you think they're like Mormons knocking on our door saying, no, Jesus actually came to North America and there's this extra piece of the puzzle that you don't know about, and you need to understand that? Like, are we ripe for the taking?
I think we should find out, because I think it's they definitely would expect people in our position, or people like us, as you said, to support the cause.
Yeah, I mean, I've just got in mind, like, Greta, I think, has just released a new book. I think it's called The Climate Book, and
really,
yeah, I think it's hot off the press, and I'm just thinking, is like this something we should be reading?
Oh, couldn't
have
hurt.
Faith.
I'll put it on the list. We wait long enough, there'll be a Netflix special about it, I'm sure.
Do you reckon Greta would
do the show?
Like on an audiobook. Do you reckon Greta would be the one? Can you imagine like 10 hours of her in your head?
When I was listening back to some of that episode or reflecting on it, I really like the part that you said around the teals and the inner city, and the fact that they feel strongly enough that climate change and supporting climate change is needed to represent their ideal standing in the community. It's important enough for them to vote these representatives in, but they're lacking the other progressive qualities that go hand in hand with any kind of conservation. Like you said, attacking their wealth or whatever. And that to me is, hilarious. They're the same people who don't want to even entertain the thought of the trading scheme or any kind of market-driven force. And it actually is really jarring when you do think about it.
I just think isn't it ironic that 15 years ago in Australia, we had an election where the Conservative Party was proposing an emissions trading scheme, or at least a market-based solution to address this. And then they lost the election, and then the Greens killed the proposal because it didn't go far enough. And then we had 15 years of just dithering and doing nothing. And it's actually a Greens party that scuppered the whole thing. So the actual true heroes in this space aren't those at the margin saying, oh yeah, let's like ban coal exports. The true heroes are the ones in the middle that can thread the needle and actually land like an outcome that actually everyone agrees with.
Yeah.
And that's stable.
Yeah. Give a person a mask and they will show you their true face. Do you know why that's on my mind?
Because you've just been to the proctologist?
That's good. No, I've been looking at Nick Kyrgios's legs, and he has that tattooed on there. But it's also very topical for our finally having this episode on the pandemic. So again, we're not doctors, but I think enough time has passed that we can actually have a conversation about this without all the panic and fear. We know a lot more now. The curve has well and truly flattened, And I think now we can start to pick through this with a bit of grace. What do you think?
I think there would be still people out there today saying, no, the curve is not flattening. The curve is still up for grabs. But I definitely agree with the premise. So it's a couple of years on. I think most of the world experienced very significant disruption and still does in many cases and in some ways. March 2020, I think, is probably the key date for most people. When did it first land with you that this is not just someone being a bit over the top?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I don't know if this memory is 100%, but I do have this memory of leaving the office for the last time. And I remember that at this point in time, we were still coming to grips with it as a company and, well, all the communications and the official communications of how serious this may be and how it may spread. So there was a call made by the company to say, pack up your things, work from home. So everyone kind of hobbled together a few things and left the office. And little did we know, we'd just never come back. And we literally didn't come back to that particular office. We were in a WeWork at the time that was dedicated just to our project team. And I remember that really vividly because when we came back over a year later, it was like time had stood still. We came into this office and everything, it was like Chernobyl. Everyone had just picked up their bare essentials. Everything was left and no one ever came back. There was clothes and drink bottles and personal effects everywhere. It was like just shifting through the rummage of a company that had just left.
What about you personally? When did it sink in? Was it the work thing that triggered that this is real, or did you have a bit of actually like say a week before that this could be significant?
I'm quite a skeptical kind of guy, so it took me quite a long time to recognize the severity of this. So leaving the office and working at home wasn't a big deal. I think at the time it was probably when the restrictions started to come in and the run on grocery stores. So having a young family and then finding out that all of a sudden people are panic buying and there are essentials that you can't get, then I started thinking, okay, yep, this is becoming a real thing that we really need to be smart about.
Just as an aside, the panic buying thing seems to be imported. So if I understand correctly, the whole thing about panic buying started because Wuhan had the lot of lockdowns and then China was doing some things, and then people in Hong Kong suddenly then thought, oh, okay, mainland Chinese people are buying up all the toilet paper here because they can't get it in other, I don't know, Wuhan must be the principal toilet paper manufacturer in China. And then so Hong Kong supplies started drying up. So then Hong Kong had the panic buying, and then that was exported first to Chatswood here in Sydney, which is a part of Sydney where there are lots of expatriates or people who've emigrated from Hong Kong, and then spread to the rest of Sydney. And then
is that right?
I think it was something like that. And it's just funny, the psychology. And at that time, there was no reason for there to be a panic of toilet paper shortages. But it's just
such an arms race, though, isn't it? Because you know that it's a panic buying situation, and you don't want to add to the issue.
If they just let prices go up, $1 for your first roll, $10 for your second roll, $100 for your third roll, that would have a pretty quick effect at killing all this stuff. But they didn't want to do it because it was this, no one wanted the bad headline of your price gouging.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, Andy. I mean, spoken like a true, market, like a economist. What about you, Andy? When do you have memories of when you started to take the pandemic seriously?
When I first saw the issues in China, in Wuhan, my first inkling was that this is 50-50. This could either be like SARS or something like that, where it was probably going to be more serious than just a bad flu, but that they'd contain it and it wouldn't, we'd be fine. But it was quite concerning when they locked down the whole city of Wuhan. So I think at that point, just the fact that they actually acted in such a severe way, I think was a signal enough that they were taking it very seriously. And so I think quite early on, I was fairly alert to it. But it was always like a probability distribution. It wasn't, there's a 100% chance it's going to come to Australia and be this big thing. It was always, there is some non-0% chance that it will come to Australia and cause havoc here.
Yeah.
And it was just whether that would actually be realized. But I did have in the back of my mind fairly early on, if the worst case scenario was realized, what it could look like, because I think, especially when some of the data was coming through around the spread of it, where it was growing exponentially. And when you think about compounding growth, even just pull out your pocket calculator and work out, what's this going to look like it's fairly easy to come up with fairly dire scenarios, especially for a country like Australia, where prior to the pandemic, Chinese overseas visitor arrivals were our top source. So it was quite easy to foresee that Australia would be heavily impacted and quite early on. But it was just, is this going to be that thing?
Yeah.
So similar to you, I do remember work, the context of this in a workplace. So I must have been the last person standing to have like a desktop PC at work. So I didn't have a laptop at the time. And I remember thinking and just playing this out in my head. And actually, a couple of weeks before we were all sent home, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before, I said, "Oh, I'd like I need a laptop just in case." And the IT department was like, "What do you mean?" Like, anyway, so I got my laptop, and I was like the crazy guy in the office. And then a couple of weeks later, everything that I thought would happen, happened.
Crazy
and,
or a visionary?
Actually, there were some pretty influential people that I'd kind of deferred my own judgment to in some ways. So Nassim Taleb, he's the guy who wrote The Black Swan.
Yeah,
and
great book.
A couple of other books on sort of probability and how we should think about events like this, and quite a few others that I sort of follow and view as sort of fairly switched on, and that they do all the sort of the hard work so I don't have to.
Yeah.
And they were kind of talking about this relatively early on, so that did definitely influence my own thinking on this.
I love the part in Black Swan when he's discussing the goat, the life of a goat, and it's like if you take a scientific approach.
You mean Roger Federer?
Yeah, Pete Sampras will always be my goat. So he talks about the goat, right? And if you look at kind of the scientific method and also past behavior being a kind of predictor for future, every day the goat wakes up and they get their feed, someone comes to look after them, they have a safe place to stay the night, and this repeats from the moment they're born right up until the day that they're slaughtered for meat. And I thought that was such a great kind of way to think about things sometimes, that unless you step back and you can see the full scale of time and the way that these cycles play out, you don't really get the full picture. And the goat doesn't get the full picture until it's too late.
So just for anyone listening, wondering what the fuck Roger's just been talking about, the premise of
let
this...
them wonder. That really makes for a good podcast when they just wonder and they don't know what you're talking about.
It's a bit like a Red Hot Chili Pepper song, isn't it? But so the concept is you can have a single event, right? So you go to a casino and you gamble and win 10 times in a row. But the thing is, you can lose everything on the 11th gamble. So it's not just because you've had a good run of luck isn't a good sense of the probabilities you're facing in that situation. And in the context of the goat, well, yeah, you wake up and you have a good life. You wake up and you eat your grass or whatever every day, but eventually you're going to have a quite different day. And I guess in the context of the pandemic, it's that one day. And in the context of the pandemic, there've actually been other events. So I think everyone goes back to that Spanish flu and, as was the last big pandemic, but there are actually other ones sort of after that. But let's say in terms of global impact, well, I'm going to go on a limb and say that that's probably where you've got to go back to the Spanish flu. So we've just gone like 100 years or more than 100 years where we haven't really had all that much happen. And so we think, we've eradicated. This is just a thing that we don't deal with anymore because I know, aren't we like really good? We've got all this new technology, but it's just, no, this stuff happens once every 100 years. And if anything, the things that give rise to these or the risk factors have actually exacerbated the impact. Yeah. So
travel, globalization,
international air travel, yep, and living in cities, urbanization, wet markets.
But the Black Swan event is a great concept, and I think you can see that with businesses and the great supply chain issues we've had, that no one predicted the fact that there would be a global pandemic, of course. And if they had, they'd had structured their businesses in a very different manner.
But this is the thing. Like, no one predicted it, but it was actually the most predictable thing in the world that we will have a pandemic. Like,
and when I say that, actually, there are many people who predicted it. Actually, whole arms of the government that came up with strategies on how to deal with this, but they just never got the funding and the cut through they needed to actually prepare
Hollywood predicted it. Like Hollywood, like what was that movie? Contagion, 2012.
Yeah.
You watch Contagion, and every scene of that movie, like even down to the conspiracy theory sort of aspect of it, is reflects reality. And I think George Bush actually, he read a book about the Spanish flu and said, "Oh, well, we need to establish a task force to to deal with this." So,
and that's what I mean.
then
Why
I
I
think
retract that statement
yeah.
that people, obviously, there's whole teams that have been made to analyze this problem,
But I
no
think
one
your
takes it
point,
seriously.
but isn't your point that individuals didn't predict it? So
That's right.
And you sign the $10 million contract for blah, and in your mind you've just assuming that the way that your business is going to run is exactly the same as it's always run, and you sign that. I mean, even individual like decisions about, oh yeah, of course I'm going to sign a 30-year mortgage when you've got like a one in three chance that you're going to have like a 100-year pandemic event by definition. So
yeah. And that's when this rented house becomes my house. Possession is the law. Martial law.
So I remember when at the time the whole principle was like this, introduce this flatten the curve concept. So
Yeah.
the point at that time was that we're all going to get it. So you're all going to get COVID at some point, but what we've got to do is slow the spread of COVID so that the hospital can accommodate all of the sick patients that come through. I actually had a concert booked in on the Friday night, and it turns out that was the final night that we were allowed to kind of get out and do things.
The last hurrah
It was
before
the
it
last
became
hurrah.
a super spreader risk.
This was a band called The Darkness touring an album called Easter is Cancelled. And it was actually a really bizarre moment. It was like a normal show, so it wasn't, people didn't seem that sort of subdued or worried necessarily, but it did feel like, we should not be like in a mosh pit right now. And
we'll get to that, different attitudes towards.
So the band themselves, they delivered on the goods, but I think that must have been like their last concert before everyone went back home. And
I'm sure a lot of musicians remember their last time too, right?
Yeah.
Before all this started. But yeah, it's a very powerful concept. My daughter mispronounced the word cupunga for the longest time when she tried to say cucumber. And we never corrected her because we knew one day it would just be gone and you can never get that back.
I have a similar thought every time I listen to Axl Rose's voice.
When was the last time you could sing properly? No,
1987.
So good. All right. So moving on from when we started to realize this was a serious thing, how have things changed for society?
I'm going to be pessimistic and say not very much. So I don't think that now we're any more prepared to deal with pandemics as individuals than we were before the pandemic. So
you think in the way that we prepare for the initial impact hasn't changed?
I don't think we've learned, for example, about, like we were talking about Nassim Taleb before and black swan events. Like I don't think this has like made us think as individuals. Just to give a really, really, really simple example, thinking about the kinds of investment decisions people were making in terms of property investments. Property prices went through the roof. They increased 20% year on year for, even more. And isn't it just the most bizarre? I mean, I know that's mostly driven by low interest rates and cheap money, but isn't it just the most bizarre thing that in a time of probably unprecedented uncertainty, at a time when in most people who are in the workforce today have never had in their lifetime a more uncertain time than what we had sort of during 2020 and 2021, that was the period when everyone decided to spend millions and millions of dollars on housing, not knowing anything about their careers, their jobs, what the future might hold.
Yeah.
And they were signing 30-year mortgages, leveraging themselves up to the hilt. So I guess in terms of thinking about black swan events, unexpected things and managing risk, nothing at all. One thing I just want to say about how it's changed us, I think it's really shaped things and changed things to just highlight just exactly what we are willing to tolerate.
We're not really as free as we thought we were. Secondary on top of that, to your point, the fact that the public actually encourages that or actually wants that control placed upon them is a second issue. But to me, the idea that the government could impose such restrictions on your life, and these are very heavy restrictions, forcing you to stay in the confines of your own home, forcing you to wear masks, making it so that you can't see a dying relative or family member or attend their funeral. These are things that we lost in the fire, and I'm not sure we've come to grips on what we've given up. I don't think we have reflected on that enough as a society.
I do see the other side, right? The other side is for this thing to work, and like, let's be clear, we're talking about lockdowns trying to get to zero, right? So let's say there's 100 cases in the community, and just to put a bit of context to this for anyone not in Australia, we in 2020 had pretty much eliminated COVID, so we'd gone to zero. The only way there was a case in Australia was because it had come from overseas, and at that time the border was closed, so they had very tight controls on anyone, like whether they're like people who were coming in for freight reasons or repatriation flights or whatever. So, and they had to do quarantine, and so it was this fairly tightly controlled sort of situation. And at the time when you only have 10, 50, 100 cases, the benefit to be gained from locking down and being extremely strict on what you can and can't do is very, very high, because the difference between getting that right and getting that wrong is an absolute shit show for the next 6 months, because it's just going to spread, and we're going to go from being a world where you're living normally to one where everyone actually has to make decisions for themselves to stay at home just to protect themselves because they don't want to go to hospital and get sick. So the payoff is so high that it's high enough to say, if your sick relative is in hospital dying, that I'm so sorry, but on behalf of the whole of society, the risk is just so high that we can't let you do that.
I understand. I understand why they would have thought that, but many things have been done under noble causes, many atrocities, right? And I think some things there should be a line under. Being able to see loved ones and connection. I think this pandemic has really raised mental health in that way, right? And what isolation really does to people and how important we are to each other. So in the effort to chase after some of those benefits that you're talking about, I don't think we dwelled long enough on what we were truly giving up or allowing the government to impose upon the people.
But I think it depends on at what stage you're talking about. So if you're talking about
at
the
any
stage.
stage.
Well, okay, so if you've got 20 cases and you know who they all are, you can say, all right, let's just deal with the 20. Yeah. But when you're detecting in sewage COVID and you don't know who these people are, that's when the merits of locking down and the potential benefits of locking down and saying, no, sorry, you can't pick the worst possible scenario. Like we've talked about loved ones seeing people in hospital care. Even if we said, no, you can't even go to the hospital to get care and you will die, because you can justify that because more people will die.
That's what I mean. You can justify anything, right? There should be some rights that cannot be taken away. But the payoffs is just it. But the payoff is always wrong, and you're dealing with people, and it didn't work, right? Well, it never does. Well, now you didn't tell the full story about what actually happened when we were down to that little. Let's wind it back to the original leak. Okay, so in Melbourne, the original outbreak that caused us spiraling into this place. Let's talk about that. It was an overseas traveller quarantining. There was a government that, for some lapse in judgment, hired some shonky security guards to mind them. And not only did they not do their job properly and break protocol, one of the guards had sex with an infected traveller that was coming back and quarantining, and then spread that rapidly to their family and friends, and then the outbreak started there. Now, isn't that dealing with humans here? But
that's all inconsequential, right? So, like, it's inconsequential because it's happened. It's human behavior. It happens.
That's what I mean. You'll never get to zero.
No, but if you have a quarantine system and the quarantine system fails, Once you have spread in the community, but let's say it's otherwise contained, it absolutely makes sense to have lockdowns because you have a realistic chance, and it's proven because it happened in Australia. You can get it to zero. You can eliminate it. So you might be locked
But you
down
can't
for
keep
a
it to
month,
zero.
2 months. Not forever, but you can keep it to zero long enough that you can, at the time, I mean, we have to put this into context that we were developing vaccines, and at that time no one was vaccinated. So you can keep it to near as close to zero as possible for as long as possible, that you can then reopen it in a safe way. But just to go back to the time that we're talking, it absolutely made sense to lock down at that time, because the alternative was you let it rip, you lose your zero, and not only do you have the really bad health outcomes, but you also have bad economic outcomes too. Everyone's going to be keeping themselves at home. They're going to make their own decision to stay at home or be less active. And so the economic outcomes aren't necessarily better.
Well, some people would.
Some people would, but if you can save thousands and thousands of lives, then it is probably worth it. But I think where this, and this is like coming back to my initial sort of the things we were willing to accept and whether we made the right trade-offs, it's harder to justify these sorts of strategies once you have 80% of the population vaccinated and you have virtually zero chance of getting to zero, and people can make their own decisions. And so I think that's when it became a bit silly. But in those early stages, I very much support the policies we adopted, because the alternative was fucking America or Europe, where they fucked it up. We didn't fuck it up, actually. We gave ourselves a situation where we got to zero in 2020. We were out living a normal life. They weren't in America. They weren't in Europe. If you go and look at deaths and economic outcomes, right, you look at a chart, we're in this like Goldilocks scenario where we had good economic outcomes and we had good health outcomes.
Well,
and then you have at the other end of the spectrum, the countries that did kind of what you're saying, which is where, no, let it rip. They had really bad health outcomes and really bad economic outcomes. So they didn't even benefit.
I don't think that's the case in one of the ones we talk about with like Sweden and stuff, is it? They end up being the same.
No, that's not true. Like the data for Sweden is they had bad health outcomes and bad economic outcomes, because they had really bad health outcomes because COVID spread through their population at a time when we didn't have vaccines, and they were the strains that were a bit more severe in terms of the health impacts. But economically, they also fucked up because people made their own decisions to stay at home.
You know, the 101 philosophy when it comes to this ethics, they always talk about a model where they say, okay, there are two different people in hospital and they're dying, right? One has a liver failing, one has a kidney failing. So you walk in there, you've got a healthy kidney and a liver. You could save them. You can give them a kidney. You can give them a part of your liver and the rest will grow back. Should you do it? And most people say, okay, I mean, that sounds reasonable. And everyone gets to live that way. We've now saved 2 lives and 3 can go on in the world. But what happens if that person needs to die to give it? Okay, no, that's clearly not right. All right, well, what if they're going to die, but they're going to die in a year's time? And it keeps on going on and on. What I'm saying is that when it comes down to it, right, like we can talk about, to me, it's the loss of your civil liberties, right? Any time where a government starts to look at sacrificing the needs of a few for the many, bad things happen, right? And I just don't think that it's a good place to be in. A lot of things are done under that noble cause. When governments get control, they crave it and they don't let it go. Look how that carried on to the vaccine, that same style of thinking.
So I've got 2 pieces of esoteric philosophy and libertarian thinking to bring in here. The first is this concept of state capacity.
State capacity sounds delicious.
So state capacity is the concept that you need a government that can do the right thing in the right situation, which is basically another way of saying good government. And then there's another extension of that called state capacity libertarianism, which is where you have a good government that can make the right decisions at the right time so that we can be free, so that we can ultimately live the lives the best possible way that we want. Now, an old school way of thinking about libertarianism is that we need small government, we need less government, and we shouldn't have government. But the problem with that is that if you don't have those things, you may not have a good government. And then so when it comes to things like a pandemic, you can't deal with them. And when you contemplate civil liberties, well, it's great to be able to do whatever you want, but not if everything else is shit. So the second concept is this idea of turnkey totalitarianism. So this is a concept where, because of the complexity of the world that we're now living in, where we have real risks that can essentially lead to our demise, the existential risks that we face, and pandemics is one of them, but there are others as well, nuclear weapons and all sorts of other things, that you need this thing called turnkey totalitarianism, which is essentially what we saw during the pandemic, which is where we go from during a normal, course of events, during business as usual environment, here are all of the things that are out of bounds. So for individual freedom, all of those things, human rights, we don't touch those. However, when that building's burning down, you need to be able to change gears, and you need to be that dictator, that authoritarian who can make the right decision at the right time. That
God,
in
you
a
sound
normal
like Julius Caesar right now. No, that's good. I mean, all roads lead back to Rome. That was the exact same thing, that the Republic breaks down at times of war, and that power is given to someone to essentially protect the Roman Republic. The only problem with that is that they never gave the power back.
So just with that point about governments once they get a taste for control, they become a dictator or whatever. The next time we have the emergence of some sort of scary looking thing in
It's the blueprint.
some far away country, right? The new thing. Can you imagine if we had the equivalent policy response to SARS, swine flu, H1N1, all those other ones, in the couple of decades before COVID? And we had similar lockdowns, because now we've set ourselves up to a situation where if you don't respond in that way, you're a negligent government.
Exactly. I want to explore the second part of this topic, which is not only did we lose a bit of our freedom and the government impose the restrictions that we never thought possible, a lot of people never thought possible, but there was a large part of the population that were calling out for it. Lock us down faster, be brave, show strong leadership. What are you waiting for? What's your commentary on that kind of behavior and the fear that was involved in that?
Strong leadership can be both locking down early, or it can be not locking down when everyone's telling you to. So ultimately, this is a question of balancing risks. And I think there were right decisions and there were wrong decisions. So without getting into specific situations and judgments, there were occasions where absolutely we nailed it. But where we probably got the decisions wrong, and where I just feel like we dragged it out a little bit too much, was like, there's only so much you can do to convince someone who doesn't want to get vaccinated. So maybe we just sort of have a policy where once we get to a stage when everyone who wants to be vaccinated can be vaccinated, and it's accessible and it's available, that's the benchmark. And if you decide not to have vaccinated, you wear the consequences, and we just get on with it and we live a normal life. Now, the other thing too, like, we've got to be mindful that as much as these arguments are like, it's great to sort of talk about personal responsibility, when you're doing like modeling on this stuff, the thing that you're looking at is actually what's our hospital bed capacity, and what is the forecast demand on our hospital beds. If you get to a situation where there's enough people who don't want to be vaccinated, and let's say it's 20%, and that 20% who are going to get COVID and end up in hospital is large enough that the hospital system is going to be overwhelmed. From a public policy perspective, I understand why you can't let that happen.
I mean, I smell a rat. That argument would only work if the vaccine actually stopped the spread of this thing, which it doesn't.
No. So that argument works because the issue isn't the spread. Now, we've got, let's say, 5 million people in Sydney. If we have 20% unvaccinated, that's 1 million people. And if you have 1 million people who get COVID unvaccinated, or whatever percentage of that 1 million that we're going to get it, they know mathematically, statistically, they can calculate what the percentage of that are going to end up in hospital. We would be fucking demolishing fields. We would be filling out arenas and turning them into makeshift hospitals. And there was no appetite to do that because that would be really bad.
But that's just not true for under 30-year-olds or under even 40-year-olds in terms of hospital admissions.
Well, it might be. I mean, it will contribute. I mean, you can say that deaths aren't high, but
hospital admissions, like if you look at the figures of people under 40 without comorbidities, it's nothing.
Yeah, but there are still younger people in hospital. So
we're talking about the modeling right here. So like the vast percentage of those people are older or with significant comorbidities, often more than 3.
You could say that you're 4 times more likely to end up in hospital if you're over 50 than if you're under 50. But if you're trying to drive a population to get vaccinated because you're trying to reduce the number of potential hospital admissions, then you're going to equally be targeting people under the age of 50 because 25% is still something.
And they did that, I believe, through fearful messaging that was manipulated and also making incredibly problematic conditions of anyone who wanted to go to work or rejoin the public community. Look, I know that we agree on a lot of things in this conversation. The reason I am going a little bit harder is that I think for a long time people have wanted to express these views, and I've spoken to a lot of people. Some of the things that I'm representing are not purely mine either, but they haven't been able to. I know a lot of people of all different ages that feel this way, but they haven't had their voices heard without being called anti-vaxxers and a bunch of other things.
So when you said they were pushing this message, right? One thing I would say is I don't think government was pushing that message. There were some people pushing that message.
All layers of government.
No, but if you read in Australia, the advice came from ATAGI, right? It was, and if you read the ATAGI advice, it's very clear. They're very upfront. They say, here is the efficacy on transmission. Here is the efficacy on reduced hospitalizations. It's not a perfect document, but it is independent advice to government. Then you have, like, a lot of the politicians actually deferred to health professionals, and they were giving largely scientific answers to the questions that they were asked. So that, every day they were having media conferences and all of that. And if someone said, does this, for example, reduce the spread? The answer would have been, we don't know. Or the answer would have been, no, but for these other reasons, whatever the time that we're talking about. I don't think they were running some line of, well, we're not going to tell you the answer. We're just going to instruct you to get it. And I think
they just saw this as a project to get completed. I've worked in enough projects to understand that this is like, I got this herd of people. I got this goal. I'm getting pressure in terms of being the leader of this government to reopen.
No, I disagree. I don't think it was like that at all. I think there was definitely appetite to have very high vaccination rates because that was seen as the way that we could reopen quicker. So you had a tension, right? You had people who were concerned about the economy, businesses, jobs, non-health outcomes, so every other outcome other than health. And the tension was, fuck, we need to get back to normal because this is killing everyone. And when it came to balancing that with the health outcomes, as in, no, we can't let it rip because this is going to result in 25,000 people dead. This was seen as the way to balance it. And so to the extent that there was any messaging around, let's treat this almost as a race or let's treat this as a goal, that was precisely to manage all the things you talked about before around being able to see loved ones and being able to. So it was cool heads about optimizing a problem, saying, well, the way to get the best possible outcome is to do this thing over here, so then we can do this thing over there.
Why was it just the vaccine? So my daughter at the time had just turned 5, which made her eligible for the Pfizer vaccine that a lot of the adults received. And she had already contracted the Omicron strain with myself and some others in my family. And so she already had natural immunity. And literally the advice was a month into that, give her the vaccine.
The advice from who?
From the medical community, from Atagi.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't from Atagi. Atagi's report was very clear that, I don't know what the age is, but it was very clear that there are pros and cons. And I think it was basically saying we don't know.
Well,
now,
COVID vaccine dosing interval for children aged 6 months to 5 years. Atagi recommends a dosing schedule for Moderna, 6 months to 5 years formulation of 2 doses 8 weeks apart.
Send me the link.
I'm serious, man. So if all you have is a hammer, right? Like, I think they see it as a project, a rollout schedule, and it is a race. Like, we're talking about kids now and the impacts. They don't have the studies to prove its safety. It doesn't stop you getting the virus, and there's no acknowledgement of natural immunity, even though there's plenty of studies showing its effectiveness.
So when I've read Atagi advice, because we had to make decisions with my own child about this, the Atagi advice wasn't mission oriented. It wasn't we want the whole world vaccinated. Okay, it was there's costs, there's benefits, there's uncertainties, and so the Atagi advice at the time I read it. So I actually don't know what the current advice is, but at the time I read it, it was essentially, here are the things that are good about it, here are the things that are bad about it, and here are all the things that we do not know at all. If the advice has changed since to have it, I guess the question is ultimately, and this is actually a really important kind of nuance here, is do you trust people to make a recommendation to you or not? So if they have done all of the research and all of the assessment, and let's say now with the benefit of 6 months, let's say it's 6 months since I last looked at it, if the circumstances have changed such that in that benefits column, they're now more confident of the benefits, in that cost column, they're more confident that the costs are not as high as it was, and in that uncertainty column, now that there's been a lot of kids that have had these vaccines, they actually have real world experience with it, that they're no longer as concerned about the uncertainties, and their advice has now changed to take it. Who the fuck are you or I to question it? Who are you to question it? Why would you get passionate about that?
So I've got a daughter who's 5 years old. She's on the very cusp of a vaccine that was rushed into development, rolled out to adults at breakneck speed, and now saying that it can help my daughter. She's just contracted the COVID-19 virus. She's asymptomatic, 0 symptoms. Yet they're telling me, trust this newly developed, rarely tested vaccine on my daughter when I know that she's just got a natural immunity and she's had 0 complications from it. Why would I do that? Why would any sane person do that?
Well, you should ask the questions that you're concerned about, right? If you're giving advice to the population, the advice that is suitable for most people within the population may not be suitable for everyone in that population for different reasons. In your situation, given those factors, I would have said, well, look, I'm concerned about whether this is the right thing to do because of reasons A, B, and C, because the Atagi advice is not for your child. The Atagi advice is for the population. And so the role of a medical professional should be to help you navigate those questions. And if you got advice that you were not satisfied with after that, then that's probably more a reflection of either one of two things. It could be that you had a shit GP, or it could have been that you don't trust their judgment.
You could say the same thing for the GPs. So are they thinking about it because they're the medical professional, or is that the advice that they've received? So the actual advice that was passed down was get her vaccinated 1 month after she's recovered from COVID. And when I asked these questions about why would I do that with the natural immunity, and there's these studies that show that natural immunity is effective in terms of antibodies, and there is a risk to kids around, even if it's small, for myocarditis and other things like that, what is the benefit in doing it now? And they couldn't give me an answer. They said, this is the advice.
In that situation, you go to see a doctor and you say, what should I do here? And they tell you their best opinion. If you raise, look, I've read this study here, I've read that study here, I've heard this over here. Now, the GP can either do one of two things. They can either give you really good answers and engage with the issues you've raised and say, for all of these reasons, you're right. For all of these reasons, you're not right. And for all these reasons, this is what I think you should do. Or they can not engage with you because they don't know themselves. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe you got someone who couldn't engage with you on the issues that you raised. They didn't know. I mean, I understand why they wouldn't know, because this is all new to everyone.
What's the harm? I got these things, they're about to expire in the fridge. Get it done.
Well, I mean, that's questioning the motivations of the GP. I mean, I think you framed it before, like there's this really transactional group that are just wanting to get to some magic target. They're all just like looking at the Gantt chart, looking at where they need to be by which date, and they're just doing whatever they need to. That's not it. That was not it. So when I had my 2 doses, I took the AstraZeneca because that was all that was available to me at the time, and they were giving me the warnings. They were saying, "Look, just so you know, are you aware that this could? Here's the form you can sign." Like, so I think this idea that, like, it isn't this just the problem ultimate, and you didn't have to, right? At the end of the day, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do.
Well, okay.
Well, you don't.
Okay.
You don't.
But it's not as simple as that, right?
Well,
you didn't have to take the vaccine as an adult either. But if you didn't, and I know friends who haven't, they can't go to their office. How long until their employer starts tolerating that? Why aren't you getting it?
I think that's an area that I have concerns over.
Don't you think I always love that argument that they bring up where a lot of liberals are, my body, my rules. I'm pro-abortion, pro-choice. It's not pro-abortion. A lot of liberals are pro-choice, my body, my rules.
Every child deserves an abortion.
You get an abortion. You get an abortion. But when it comes to their support of the vaccine, that kind of breaks down in terms of the greater good and being a socially, responsible citizen. We spoke last week in the climate change episode about what gives you the right to participate in a certain topic, especially when there is complexity and there's scientific research and literature that you have to review. I think this is like one of those cases where just because you don't have, show me your medical degree, otherwise shut the fuck up. And I don't think that's a good place to be in, especially when the government and society is asking a lot of you to do things that you normally would need a lot of thinking on. So I kind of think that your point earlier about when medical advice or public advice policy is put out there, it's for a population. It's not for the individual. And I think that's the part that was missed in the pandemic. Taking that policy and that population level medical advice and translating it to the individual and the individual circumstance. That was done very poorly in my kind of opinion.
One of the things that public health officials got wrong was giving a message that was intended to have a behavioral effect, but that was not reflective of their actual view or the actual scientific reality. So, for example, earlier on in the pandemic when there was this, don't wear a mask because, oh no, it's not going to help, it's bad, when the rationale for recommending against wearing masks was because they wanted to keep the supply for medical professionals who actually needed it. So the rationale is fair. It's just that if your chief medical people who are going to be the spokespeople that you want to believe going forward are telling you don't wear a mask because it's bad, oh, it's not going to help. It might even make it worse. It might even you might even get COVID because you bought one from Wuhan.
I think there's we don't trust you to actually be smart enough to wear this mask appropriately, and therefore you wear it wrong. You touch your face more and give you a false sense of security.
Yeah, that's what
these half truths, right?
Actually, and the other one in this space was challenge trials. So with the vaccine, so that we should let people get vaccinated, but then expose themselves to COVID, and then within isn't one of the ironies that the vaccine that we're all using now was developed within a couple of days of the pandemic. So if you had challenge trials, we could have saved probably hundreds of thousands of lives or millions of lives if we allowed things like challenge trials to go ahead. And they could have worked out, the efficacy is good, let's roll it out, double down on this one because it works the best. Whereas the thinking at the time was, no, we can't do that because that's not ethical. Just to kind of balance this out, because we talked a bit about the ATARG advice or this, maybe the scientific advice or whatever, and maybe they weren't accommodating of all of the different perspectives, but there does need to be a bit of acknowledgement just how many crazy conspiracy theories were out there. And if you're a medical professional responding to that, you're trying to kind of bring people, and it's ironic that this is the middle. you're trying to bring people to the middle and try and engage people and get them out of these fucking crazy like rabbit warrens they've been down. What's your take on the conspiracy theory side of things?
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's actually the medical profession, they're their own worst enemy, right? Like, there's a reason why the doctors and their bedside manner comes up so much, because they just suck at speaking to people and actually communicating. They see us as sometimes parts that need to be fixed or changed out. So I think the communication issues hurt, and that adds to the level of distrust in doctors. People never like going to the doctors anyway because it's usually bad news, and then that just morphs into this general distrust. In terms of conspiracy theorists, I love a good one. So I like it more for the entertainment value, but the people who are in that culture, I think, is very infectious. It makes them feel, in a world where they can't quite understand or grasp the complexity, it gives them a solution and a community that they can feel validated in. So I think it's got that real infectious meme style approach that is very, it's kind of very insidious in that way. Now, saying that, I do think if, behind the curtain, there's some people who run the show wanted to inoculate the population to achieve a certain outcome or achieve a certain kind of tagging or semi, sterilization or whatever it may be, you couldn't write a better script in some ways. In terms of how do you get people to comply? You need fear, you need risks, you need stakes on the table. It's almost a perfect script on how to control a population. So
this is just a way to deal with climate change.
Climate change, sterilization, maybe equipping us to give birth to the next generation of geniuses or super soldiers. Who knows? But I mean, come on, it's a pretty good way to do it.
So I have a conspiracy theorist in the family in relation to
your boy's a bit young, isn't he?
To COVID. Yeah, no, it's not him. It's not my wife either. So the magic of a conspiracy theory around this stuff is to convince someone that they know the truth and everyone else is hoodwinked. So it means you can't have a conversation with them. There's no terms that you can convince them that they're wrong.
You can say cave, isn't it?
Well, you can say to them, you've just been reading the wrong things on the internet.
Yeah.
You're reading the wrong sources. And then they just go back to you. No. What you don't understand is you've been reading the wrong resources. You've been trusting the government. You've been trusting the politicians that tell you this. Whereas the reality is, let me show you these videos on YouTube. These will tell you the truth, and they'll explain why everything that you're listening to and you're trusting is wrong. And
I love it. Did you follow him down the rabbit hole? Sorry, did you follow them down the rabbit hole?
Well, you watch the videos because you just
the entertainment value,
right? Entertainment, but it gets really. I mean, and just to be clear, these are not at the margin. The kind of conspiracy theories that I'm talking about are literally like Bill Gates and the Rockefellers and all this just crazy shit. And it's just like, where the fuck does this come from?
I think late night in someone's basement. I think that's probably where it came from. But I find all that quite interesting, and I do feel sometimes that there is truth, or conceptual truth at least, sprinkled in those theories that needs to be explored. Joe Rogan's a really good example of someone who wasn't trying to be a conspiracy theorist. He was trying to, like he has always done, take control of his own health and wellness. He's someone that cares deeply about wellness and is willing to do the research and the trial and error. And so when he reached out for treatment options, not just the vaccine, he was totally
he took
hung up
horse
to dry.
tranquilizer.
Yeah. Ivermectin and stuff. And look, there is a very, very ugly side to the conversation. If we leave our shores for a second, absolutely there are big pharma interests going on.
Talk me through this big pharma piece.
When I say big pharma, I'm talking about the general industry that obviously creates all these drugs. They advertise to the public and stuff, and they have a long history of payouts and criminal pleas and charges.
But you shouldn't conflate those, right? Like you can't hold the sins of the past against the experience. I mean, this is about COVID, right? We're not talking about big pharma in the general
Well,
sense. We're talking,
this came from our discussion on conspiracy theorists, and all I was saying was that if you look at the way they're thinking, why would they trust that given the proved history? And I guarantee that the conspiracy theorists that talked about these pharmaceuticals misrepresenting drugs or knowing the impacts and potential dangers of marketing it anyway and giving out bonuses, they would have been called mad then too. And then it comes out. And then you say, oh, well, now they're proven. Now they're actually paying $2.3 billion compensation, and that's not the end of it. Why should we trust this organization? So that's all I'm saying, that I think that it's very easy for that kind of corporate trust to seep into the conversation around conspiracy. I want to talk a little bit about lockdowns and isolation, because this was a huge part of the experience, and it's something that we all experienced in very different ways because we all have very different lives and very different living circumstances. So I want to kind of get a bit more personal now. Can you tell me how the lockdown was for you and how it affected you and your family?
Yeah, it was lockdown was an interesting experience. I actually, part of me enjoyed it, I have to admit. So
even after the novelty wore off?
Well,
describe to the viewers like your environment though to begin with.
So I in a relatively small apartment, but to be honest with you, if I'm 100% honest, it's hard for me to think of more negatives than positives. So the positives,
that's a real indictment on work and office culture, I think.
Well, I was in a fortunate position that I could decide what I did, when I did it, how I did it, and I was trusted, and it was
So the nature of your work did involve so much teamwork then?
It did involve teamwork, but the irony is that some of the best teamwork I did was done during COVID because it was energizing. A moment like COVID comes up, you want to step up.
Talk to me a little bit about the remote working and how it affected or didn't affect your relationships with your colleagues.
Before COVID, I never worked from home. So it was a bit of a shift for me. And then I must admit, I loved the idea of working from home because it meant two things. First of all, didn't have to commute, but it also meant I could do things like, well, I'm just going to go and sit in the park on my chair and just make calls.
Yeah.
Did you get like fully absorbed into like the Uber Eats merry-go-round during COVID?
I did a little bit, but I suspect not as much as you because I live out in the burbs and you're living in the inner city at the time. So you had much more attractive options than
that's true.
My Eagle Boys pizza.
So I probably put on not as much as 10 kilos. That's too much, but somewhere between 5 and 10, probably more than 5.
What about just the effect of lockdown and isolation?
I didn't really have any situation where I felt this is causing a problem.
Even homeschooling?
The homeschooling was a bit frustrating just because like it's hard to work and then you have this guilt that, you like, because at the end of it, like, fuck, I'll be honest, homeschooling, there was not a lot of schooling going on, right? And then so it's actually more the guilt. And I don't like, to be honest, like there might be some families where they pulled it off, but I think most families probably didn't pull it off.
Do you buy into
this guilt factor?
Yeah. Do you buy into this whole thing that we've got a generation of kids now that are severely delayed?
I think it would be underestimating the capacity of kids to recover and snap back. So one of the interesting anecdotes was when during the Second World War, similar sort of circumstance, they sent kids off to the countryside and they missed out on school, and they did studies on the impact on their schooling.
I hope those studies weren't run by the kids that were actually there.
11 out of 10 kids were better off as a result.
Well, my kids were a bit younger, so I had the problem more that they wanted to keep on coming to see me. And I have this thing about I don't want to be a father that like gives lots of these memories to my kids of me just working in an office. Like their memory of me is seeing the back of me at a desk somewhere and constantly trying to get my attention and not getting it because I'm working all the time. My son had this heartbreaking thing where he he saw my keyboard and he like set up he like took a few things from my desk when I wasn't there, and he set up this like makeshift office and was like, "Don't bother me, I'm working." And he's like tapping away at the keyboard, and I just it's cute as hell, but my heart sank because like he's got this memory of me working, right? And that's not what I want for him. So I found that quite challenging, right? And they have this idea of the things that cause stress in your life are these micro transitions, transitioning from being an employee to a father to a husband to all these things, right? And the commute often acts as that transition, that third space, if you will, to transition effectively into those roles. And when you don't transition properly into those roles, and you start talking to your loved ones as if they're colleagues or whatever, that's when you get in trouble. And I found that quite challenging. I found with the remote working, it was an interesting concept because I feel like, at least in my organization, there wasn't a policy about keeping your camera on. And when you don't have your camera on for video conference, it's like the Wild West. Anything could be happening behind that avatar, man. So I think it was kind of liberating in a way. And I think it's like the end of like bias and racism in a way. Like if everyone is just contributing from their voice and you don't get to see them, you don't get to see how they dress, how they walk, how they, all these things, I think that actually that has some benefits in terms of removing people's unconscious bias. And I kind of found that to be a positive. The biggest thing though for you and I is that we both have office-based jobs, white collar work. There's such a huge divide in those that work in more, I suppose, hospitality, client-facing roles that were really heavily impacted, and there was a very big divide in the lifestyles of those two people who could still draw a salary that was somewhat immune to these changes, right?
Yeah, and that's a pretty important point too. Like, it's the funny meme is like, oh, you can't work from home, or well, you should learn to code. Well, unfortunately, not everyone can learn to code, and those who do learn to code are probably going to be losing their jobs.
Oh yeah,
to people from the Philippines or AI even.
Yeah, you know what work from home has been really bad for, besides your waistline? Middle managers. Oh my God. Because I think it's the perfect storm, right? Already, the only people who get into middle managers are the ones that are trying to get out of middle managers, right? Because they just want to go up to the senior levels. There's been this myth that you need this middle management layer in the office, supervising, managing, leading their teams. And as a result, when you go into middle management, you lose some of those worker bee skill sets. So you're really just there to kind of keep the sludge moving and problem solve and escalate. And what they've found through this work from home remote is that they're just not needed. And so it's really, I think, an existential threat to this middle management layer in some organizations. And that's why I find the strongest push to return to the office is usually from the middle management layer, because it's their role to actually inspire and problem solve and manage the team. And how can you claim the credit for managing a team if you're not there kind of working with them? They're kind of the teams running themselves.
So can I ask you, we've talked about work from home in the context of lockdowns, but we're now kind of out of the pandemic and there's no restrictions on going to the office. How do you feel about working from home now? What do you think about, let's say, workplaces trying to bring people back to the office? Is the office a thing of the past? What's the deal going forward?
What's the future work? For me, the fog's lifted, right? Everyone knew it, but they didn't really want to talk about it. And the higher you rose in an organization, in the hierarchy, the more important the office culture became to you for those reasons I talked about with middle management. But for the average worker bee that gets stuff done and wants to come in and just do a good job, it's really changed what work-life balance really means. Cut out this stupid rat race, these really long commutes that we have in the cities, and use some of that time to do your job a bit better. Use the other time to make sure that you can look after your family, spend time with your loved ones and your family. And that is the future of work, right? That blend. Absolutely, there are some teams that will need to meet on a different face-to-face in a different cadence. There are some industries that can't have that. But this pandemic has proved that we have the tools. We have the tools necessary to work remotely really effectively. Yeah. And any organization should have that as part of their mix and their kind of what they are giving to employees in terms of working conditions, in my opinion.
So I'm going to push back on that a little bit. All of the benefits from working from home accrue to the employee. No longer having to commute, that's a benefit to the employee. Work-life balance, that's a benefit to the employee. Being able to spend more time with family, that's a benefit to the employee. All of the costs associated with working from home accrue to the employer. Less effective collaboration, that's a cost to the employer. Difficulties building a culture, that's a cost that accrues to the employer. and the inability to train and blood new staff. That's a cost to the employer. So I'm not so sure we've reached like the new equilibrium. I think a lot of employees like that now they can get jobs and where there's still this sort of notion of working from home. But a lot of the costs and problems with like remote work haven't been realized yet. So things like, how do you make sure that people, like let's say young people who enter the workforce, have good role models in the workplace? And what does that mean for their development? Like we can't know yet because it's only been like 1 or 2 years. So I'm not 100% sold on this. The office has to be a part of the future. Maybe not 5 days a week, but
and I
3
think
days a week maybe.
I think that most people agree with that. Like they want some combination, right? Depending on their temperament and the kind of industry that they work in. In terms of your list, in terms of the costs and the benefits, I would challenge some of those things around collaboration and culture. It's not, and I actually think that when they talk about, water cooler conversations and this and that actually is not always the best in terms of collaboration and communication anyway. That kind of forms your in-group, out-groups, and doesn't actually have that diversity. And also, I think a big financial benefit that we miss there is that a lot of companies have downsized their physical office space, and there has been a dollar value benefit for a lot of companies as they've downsized. And even before the pandemic, they were already trying to do that by pushing up utilization rates and kind of allowing for hot desking and things like that. I do agree with you that training of new people is a bit of a conundrum because that in a lot of industries needs a face-to-face touch. But I think that the technology is there to start learning and learning from those challenges that you mentioned.
I'm much more pessimistic on technology than you are. So I think the problem with technology is that humans are humans. We don't communicate via text-based messaging. Like we
communicate differently.
But just to give a practical example, like if you're new or you don't even have to be new, but if there's something you don't know how to do, you enjoy that personal, like that dynamic of being able to ask someone, hey, how do I do this thing? That person sitting next to you, how do I do this thing? Like that's lost. Like there's no way you can replicate that.
But that's what I mean. That is not always the best outcome for both you and the person sitting next to you. It might be much better for you to easily access the right person through a digital means.
Yeah, but the right person,
at the right time.
You're going to spend half an hour finding the right person.
Not if the technologies work.
But the technology will never replicate that because with those situations, it's not just the transactional, I need to know how to do this thing, you tell me how to do this thing. It's actually building rapport. That's the way you build rapport with someone. Like one of the things I think Benjamin Franklin said this was that the best way to build a human connection with someone is to ask them to do you a favor. So the way you break down a barrier with someone isn't to do them a favor, it's to ask someone to do you a favor.
I'm sure his slaves appreciated that favor.
Well, I don't think there was much asking involved.
They're enablers, and they will only get better. I know personally for me, it's been a real wake-up call that I actually don't need as much social interaction than you think. You can survive off way less than you think you might need. But that's just me.
Yeah, some of us have found peace with our inner hermits.
So you know that story about the Chinese therapist that I saw back from episode 3, and he was talking about the mountain chicken.
Oh, yeah.
Well, at the time, China still had a very, strict COVID policy, and he was saying that if he wanted to return, he'd have to jump through a million hoops, essentially spend the better part of a month in hotel quarantine, self-funded, and it just wasn't working. Now, obviously, China has recently relaxed those rules now that containment's not really an issue with all these severe outbreaks. But why were they doing this when the population is essentially vaccinated and hospitalizations are much lower?
I would say there's a couple of things in what you've just said that's not quite right. The first, you said they're vaccinated. So sure, they have the Sinopharm or whatever, the Sinovac, I don't even know what it's called. But anyway, it's a Chinese developed vaccination, but it's actually much less effective. And they haven't rolled out other alternative vaccines which are much more effective. So those who do have the vaccine have a much less effective vaccine. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that they also have challenges getting people vaccinated, because there's two problems in China with respect
They're
to,
relying on the mountain chickens too much.
well, I guess the mountain chickens were just so effective at reducing COVID. But no, look, with very low COVID prevalence since like really the start of the pandemic in 2020, people in China, they haven't really had the same incentives to get vaccinated. I mean, why would you get vaccinated if there isn't COVID? That might be changing now that there have been outbreaks, but I guess they haven't seen the same higher rates of vaccination as some other countries have.
What I don't understand is why the government just didn't make them do it.
Does the government want to expend its political capital on forcing people to get vaccinated when there's all sorts of conspiracy theories and different ideas and different thoughts? Is this the battle that they want to?
But a few months ago, it sounded like they were doing much worse by essentially locking down the whole of Shanghai or other major cities.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was at that time, and now the game's completely changed. It seemed like every major city in China would have had to have some sort of restrictions with some of the outbreaks. I mean, the calculus changed, and people power was too strong. I mean, the government in China couldn't lock down every city in China, otherwise they'd have mass protests and things like that. We know how protests in China go down. So, but that said, it was fairly scary to see some of the restrictions in place at the time.
And do you think that drone video is real, where the drones flying around and policing people staying in their apartments and stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Did you see the one with the dog?
No.
The robot dog. Oh, apparently there's a robot dog. Stay in your...
Dogs are poor choice, isn't it, for China?
They're pretty cute, aren't they?
And their meat is delicious.
All right, Roger. So we've been through COVID. I think we're trying to call it that we're through to the other side. What lessons have we learned? What happens the next time? I mean, one of the suggestions is that like we got like the light touch here with COVID. Like we got like a pretty good pandemic, really, because low deaths, wasn't that deadly. We got lucky with the vaccine. But next time it might be much more, or like orders of magnitude more serious. Have we learned any lessons?
I think we've maybe we're still learning those lessons. I think that's clear from even our conversation today, right? I'm not sure society has had the conversations that you and I have just had with each other and still being able to walk away as friends, right? I think we need to have it out and kind of make sure that people feel heard so that we actually do take that into account. Because I think if you only look at the overall numbers, economic figures, you probably miss a lot of the sentiment and how people are feeling and how they've dealt with the trauma of the whole pandemic. We haven't allowed space for people to really vent in that way, is my opinion. In terms of the way we respond to things, I think that we need probably a little bit more unity in terms of the states and how we've responded to things. It was very adversarial, and each kind of premier of each state became almost their own cult leader, battling and jockeying against each other, which I think divides us. And then I think there needs to be more from the public recommendation. We're learning that the way that we translate that down to an individual's health decisions and how they control that, how they're responsible for that, needs a little bit of work. And that includes mental health as well, right? For some people, it would be great to kind of understand that isolating them might be more damaging than the COVID situation in itself. What about you? What do you think the learnings are?
Governments need to invest a lot of time thinking very deeply about what the lessons of COVID are and the response to COVID.
Royal Commission now.
Royal Commission, but even beyond that, like I would, if a government said we're going to set up a COVID learnings department and their whole job is just to look at everything and pick out the winning strategies from Australia, look at abroad, what they did, and work out which ones worked well, which ones didn't work well, and internalize what should be the plan. Like we shouldn't waste this. Like this is like an experiment that we'll never get back, or hopefully we don't get back again. But
hopefully
we did things. We did things during COVID that we've never done before, and it would be good to dedicate some resources to think about what we did right and what we did wrong. And I think if we just keep, and like you can't expect the current organs of government to do that because they've got their day jobs. So we need almost like a
rare situation where I agree with making a special committee. I think there's also a risk that we have a false sense of security that we cruise through this pandemic, right? A global pandemic is a very, very high existential threat to humanity. And just because this one was on the milder side doesn't mean that we'll be as lucky next time.
Yeah.
And there is a risk that could happen, that we could kind of shrug it off. We'll get through.
The pandemic was a little bit like the building is burning down. You have to make some very quick decisions. Whoever is in charge has to decide, do I order you to stop eating your lunch because this building's burning down, and if you don't do that, you might die? Like, I don't even have a right to be here. This is your premises. But in an emergency situation, you have to do things that you don't do during normal circumstances. When you have a situation where the risks are so high in terms of deaths, but also like a lot of these decisions, like we can't forget that there was a lot of unknowns at the time. So we didn't really know. Like, so the precautionary principle was at play, which meant that they had to basically expect the worst and then make decisions on that basis. And in that situation, there were a lot of decisions made that we might, in hindsight, go, well, that was probably a bit over the top. But at the time, in the absence of knowing what, 2020 hindsight sort of looked like, yeah, they did make some wrong calls. And the fact that they made as few wrong calls as they did is probably a testament to that we're well served. What was the earlier name for it?
The Wuhan flu. Coronavirus.
And then the beer company decided that wasn't good for their the sales. So
little do they know that alcohol consumption would skyrocket.
It's the best thing ever for their
Dan Murphy's was just like,